In 1833, when the British Empire abolished slavery, a panicked group of plantation owners in Barbados made a desperate decision. They liquidated their estates. They took their government compensation payouts, millions in today's money, and they fled to England. But these were not white planters. These were wealthy families of color who had owned sugar plantations and enslaved workers themselves. They arrived in London with chests full of cash and a plan. They would erase their past and buy their way into the British aristocracy. And it worked. They bought townhouses in Belgravia. They sent their sons to Oxford. They married their daughters into white noble families. Within one generation, they had transformed from Caribbean slave owners into British royalty. This is the dark, untold story of the Black Victorians who used blood money to buy respectability, and how they buried their history so deep that even their descendants do not know the truth. Let us begin on a sugar plantation that should not have existed. In 1750, Barbados was the wealthiest colony in the British Empire per square mile. Sugar was white gold. The island's plantations produced millions of pounds annually, shipped to Britain, where it fed the growing appetite for sweetened tea and desserts. The system was brutal. Over 80% of the island's population was enslaved. White planters owned the land and the people who worked it. But there was a legal loophole in Barbados that did not exist in most slave societies. Free people of color could own property, and if they had the capital, they could own enslaved people. How did free black people get capital in the first place? Some were the children of white planters and enslaved women who were freed and given inheritances. Some accumulated money through skilled trades like carpentry, tailoring, or maritime work. A very few inherited plantations outright when white fathers acknowledged them in wills. By 1800, approximately 5,000 free people of color lived in Barbados. Most were poor or working class. But about 200 families had accumulated serious wealth. They owned small plantations. They owned urban properties in Bridgetown. And yes, some owned enslaved workers. The contradiction was stark. Free black plantation owners whipping enslaved black field workers. It was a moral horror that haunts this entire story. But these families justified it through class, not race. They saw themselves as a separate class. They dressed like English gentry. They sent their children to be educated in Britain. They attended Anglican churches and adopted British customs. They were, in essence, trying to become black Englishmen. And for a while it worked. The British colonial administration gave them a specific legal status. They were free coloreds, above enslaved people, below whites, but with property rights that meant something. They paid taxes. They served in militias. They held minor government positions. They operated in a narrow band of social mobility that should not have existed in a slave society. The wealthiest of these families, names like the Prescotts and the Collymores, accumulated estates worth tens of thousands of pounds. In today's value, millions of pounds. They were landowners, and in a sugar economy, land was everything. Then came the 1820s. Britain was changing. The abolitionist movement was gaining power. Wilberforce and others were pushing Parliament to end slavery throughout the empire. The white planters in Barbados resisted. They argued that ending slavery would destroy the economy, that compensated emancipation would bankrupt them. But the free people of color were in a strange position. Publicly, some supported abolition because it was the morally correct stance. Privately, they were terrified. If slavery ended, they would lose their labor force. Their small plantations would become unworkable without free labor. And worse, they feared that once enslaved people were freed, the racial hierarchy would collapse entirely. They would no longer be the middle class between whites and slaves. They would just be black, subject to the same discrimination as everyone else. When the Abolition Act passed in 1833, the free people of color faced a choice. stay in Barbados and try to maintain their status in a post-slavery economy, or leave. Take the compensation money the British government was paying for the people they technically owned, sell their estates, and reinvent themselves somewhere else. Many chose Britain, not the Caribbean, not America. Britain. Why Britain? Because in London they could be exotic rather than inferior. A wealthy man from Barbados with an Oxford education could pass as a colonial gentleman. The British upper class was fascinated by the colonies. A black family with money and British manners was unusual enough to be interesting but not threatening. They were not competing for British land or British jobs. They were just there, wealthy and foreign. The families who made this move in the 1830s and the 1840s arrived in London with substantial capital. They bought townhouses in respectable but not aristocratic neighborhoods, Bloomsbury, Marylebone, areas where new money was acceptable. They enrolled their children in British schools. They attended Anglican churches. They hired English servants. Within one generation, their Caribbean origins became a footnote. Their grandchildren grew up speaking with British accents. They attended Cambridge and Oxford. They married into other colonial families, sometimes white ones. And slowly their Barbadian past faded into family lore. But the sugar money remained. The estates they sold in Barbados in the 1830s had generated enough capital to sustain multiple generations. They invested in British industries. They bought railway shares. They purchased government bonds. The wealth, originally extracted from enslaved labor on Caribbean plantations, was laundered through the British financial system and became respectable. By the 1880s, some descendants had no idea their fortunes originated in Barbadian sugar. The family stories emphasized the British side, the Oxford degrees, the London townhouses. The Caribbean plantations were conveniently forgotten. This was deliberate. In Victorian Britain, slavery was seen as morally repugnant, and having wealth connected to slavery was embarrassing. So the families rewrote their narratives. They emphasized their free status. They downplayed or outright erased the fact that they had owned enslaved people. They became known as colonial merchants or West Indian landowners in the official records. The specific details blurred. There was another advantage to being in Britain rather than America. Britain did not have the same racial segregation that American cities enforced. A wealthy black family in London could attend the theater, dine in restaurants, and move through society with fewer restrictions than they would face in New York or Philadelphia. They were not accepted as equals by the British aristocracy, but they were not violently excluded either. They existed in a gray zone where money and British manners could buy a certain level of tolerance. Some families thrived in this environment. They built successful businesses. They intermarried with other colonial families of color from India, Ceylon, and West Africa. They created a small but distinct community of colonial elites of color in Victorian and Edwardian London. But the price was erasure. To succeed, they had to distance themselves from their Barbadian roots. They had to downplay their African ancestry. They had to become as British as possible, and they had to never, ever talk publicly about where the money came from. By the early 1900s, the original generation who had fled Barbados was dying. Their children and grandchildren had been raised as British. Some had never even visited the Caribbean. The plantations that had funded their education were long sold. The connection to Barbados became purely ancestral. During World War I and World War II, some descendants served in the British military. They were officers, not enlisted men. Their education and class status gave them access to positions of authority. They were defending the empire that their grandfathers had fled to for safety. The irony was complete. But the post-war era brought new challenges. Britain was broke. The empire was collapsing. Colonial subjects across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean were demanding independence. And racial tensions in Britain were rising as immigration from the West Indies increased. Suddenly, being a colonial of color was less charming and more complicated. The families who had carefully cultivated their status found themselves lumped together with new Caribbean immigrants who were arriving as laborers. The class distinction they had maintained for a century was dissolving. By the 1960s and the 1970s, most of these families had made another choice. They assimilated completely into white British society. Those who could pass did. Those who could not moved to Canada, Australia, or back to the Caribbean. The townhouses were sold. The estates were liquidated. The family papers were donated to archives or destroyed. The deliberate erasure that began in the 1830s was complete by the 1970s. Today, historians estimate that dozens of families made this transition from Barbadian plantation wealth to British respectability. But tracking them is nearly impossible. The records were deliberately obscured. The family trees were pruned. The stories were not passed down. Some descendants alive today have no idea their ancestors owned sugar estates in Barbados. They know they have colonial roots. They may know they have some distant Caribbean connection. But the specifics, the plantations, the enslaved labor, the flight to Britain with compensation money, all of it is gone from family memory. And that was the point. To survive, they had to forget, or pretend to forget. The Barbadian sugar dynasties teach us something about how wealth can cross borders, but history cannot always follow. These families successfully transferred their fortunes from the Caribbean to Europe. They educated their children at the finest universities. They preserved capital across multiple generations, but they could only do it by erasing the origin story. The mansions they bought in London still stand. Some are now museums or luxury apartments, but the plaques do not mention that the money came from Barbadian sugar. The family histories do not mention the plantations. The erasure is so complete that even the descendants do not know. The wealth survived, the truth did not, and perhaps that was the trade they had to make. In the 19th century, you could be black and wealthy, or you could be British and respectable, but you could not be both honestly. So they chose respectability, and the cost was their history. The fascinating coda to this story is that some of these families' wealth still exists today. There are British families with Caribbean surnames who trace their lineage back to Barbados, but have no idea their ancestors were plantation owners. The capital that started in sugar fields has been invested, reinvested, and transformed so many times that its origin is invisible. That is the ultimate success of money. It can outlive memory. It can outlive truth. The sugar dynasties that fled to Britain wanted to be forgotten, and they succeeded. But in that success, they lost something that American black dynasties, despite all their struggles, managed to keep. They lost their story. And a dynasty without a story is just money. And money alone does not last forever.